feeling that the world is full of disasters, calamities, catastrophes? Well, so did our ancient ancestors. From wars to earthquakes, floods to famines, this series will reveal how scientists are now unearthing the evidence for cataclysmic events in the past and their disastrous consequences. Fabulous cities abandoned.
The city died.
The people here meant to stay here forever, but something went wrong.
Battlefields, long forgotten.
This onslaught of warriors hopping ashore and just causing mayhem and havoc.
We don't have any other archaeological site where we see a conflict of this dimension in that period.
Sophisticated civilizations toppled and lost to the mists of time.
I think it's up there with the modern tsunamis you see hitting the news today.
To our ancient ancestors suffering these catastrophes, it must have seemed as though they were cursed. But science is now exploding those myths and rewriting history. In this episode, the last days of the Roman Empire and the power vacuum that followed its collapse. A time when new tribes vied for power and populations fell victim to hardship and disease. What would the world look like after Rome had fallen? Scandinavia was never conquered by the Romans, but it was no stranger to conflict. By the 5th century, it was home to small clans jostling for supremacy and wealthy from trade and raids on the Roman Empire. But in Sweden, mystery surrounds a settlement which was abandoned after what seems to have been more than just a battle.
Today, this site is more or less just a stone wall and a grass surface. But if you look closer, you can see some unevenness in the surface, and this is actually the remains of 53 houses. This is an extraordinary site, mainly because of the events that took place here.
In 2010, archaeologists made a sensational discovery on the peaceful-looking Swedish island of Åland. They found signs of a horrific event here 15 centuries ago.
What we've found when we did excavations here is that more or less everywhere we excavate, we come across human remains. And it's not burials, it's people who seem to have been slain in this ring fort and also left where they have been killed.
But who inflicted this carnage at the village of Sandbyborg, and why? Ludwig's team investigated further.
On several of the skeletons, it has been documented cuts in the head or blows to the head and different types of injuries that have occurred in connection to death. And we actually have even one case of a decapitation. So actually, it doesn't look too much like a battle. It looks more like executions.
In Sandbyborg, so far, in the 10% that we have been digging, we have found around 30 individuals. And counting the whole ring fort, we think that maybe 250 people have been killed here.
I imagine that maybe this happened during the night. The perpetrators were able to get inside the ring fort in some way, and some people just suddenly turned against the others.
While the attackers left no trace, the team have unearthed precious clues about the victims.
We have these exquisite pieces of jewelry hidden away in different caches in the ring fort. Among those artifacts, there are 7 brooches of really exclusive character. And those brooches, relief brooches, are usually connected to elite women.
They are all made of silver and they are gilded, and they have the most unique ornamentation with small animals and hands and birds and dragon heads. It was a big surprise, and it is unique in Scandinavia.
A scarce resource in Sweden, the craftsmen must have used silver from the Roman Empire to make these objects.
They were positioned here, holding a cap or some shawl or something together, so they were made to be seen. So it shows that the people who wore these were the height of the elite. Maybe they were gathering together to try to organize a war against the other kings on the island, and they struck first.
Could the death suggest an attack on high-status rivals provoked by jealousy of their wealth? The team found one body with signs of especially brutal treatment.
In 2014, there was a larger excavation where we covered the central part of the house, and then we located a big fireplace central in the house. And across that fireplace, there was found a skeleton of an older man.
This man, when he was killed, he fell over a burning firestead, and you can actually see burn marks on his pelvis area. We have here, for instance, soot and parts, and what we can see, he fell over the fireplace while it was burning, and it kept burning when he was lying there. We think that maybe this person was killed with a crushing wound to his head, because there is very little left of the head, and then it was an instant kill. And we can see, if you hold the pieces together, you can see there is a very straight line showing where the cut was positioned.
Did the attackers simply fail to find the treasure? Or was theft not the object of the attack? A macabre message left with the body adds to the mystery.
Inside the jaw, we found 4 teeth from goats or sheep. The animal teeth must have been placed in the mouth of the deceased. But we think actually that's one of these ultimate humiliation acts that we can see traces of in this massacre.
For the team, the humiliating death provides a clue about this person's role on the island and a possible reason for the attack.
He is probably the chieftain, and he was killed just in front of his high seat where he was sitting and greeting his ceremonial greeting with guests. And this was traditionally a room for peace and discussion. You were not allowed to bear weapons or kill anyone. The worst thing possible is to kill the chieftain inside his hall building. And that is exactly what they have done here.
The attackers' final insult was to leave the bodies where they lay.
He was not allowed to get buried, because then you can't get to the next life, to the afterlife. And that is a power statement.
The team can only guess at the connection between these vindictive killers and their victims. But their finds suggest a link to events in the world beyond the island.
The Roman Empire was struggling in warfare, and the Huns came in the middle of the 5th century and invaded, and the Roman Empire's bureaucracy started to fail.
The Roman gold coins found on Öland, they date mainly from the early 5th century and up to 477 or something. Then we have practically no coins after that. So it seems that the networks that enabled chieftains and local elites on Öland to obtain these gold coins, those networks broke down when the Western Roman Empire fell.
Whilst we may never know the truth behind this brutal massacre, The team's investigations suggest Sandby Borg was doubly cursed by clans pitted against each other, competing for diminishing wealth and power. And by Rome's collapse, sending shockwaves far beyond the borders of empire. Coming up, the Hun attack on Rome's empire in the east.
It was a huge shock for the Romans.
Marking the beginning of the end for the Roman age. The Roman Empire's collapse was gradual. 5 centuries of overexpansion and increasing misrule meant it was open to attack. By 441 CE, it was in disarray, with the heart of the empire, Rome itself, besieged by fierce Germanic tribes. With Rome on its knees, the last thing it needed was a new threat from the east. Just over 60 years ago, construction workers in Serbia stumbled across signs of ancient civilization beneath the town of Sremska Mitrovica. Archaeologists were intrigued. How old were the ruins? Their excavations revealed a large walled city and a vast residence with underfloor heating, mosaics, and frescoes, items of luxury. The grandeur and the abundance of precious porphyry stone suggested an imperial Roman palace, and most likely the town of Sirmium, on the edge of the Roman Empire. But only by using modern techniques could the archaeologists finally date the ruins half a century after their discovery.
According to these latest research results that we got from the excavations, the imperial palace was built during the first decade of the 4th century.
The date fell within the Roman era, but why would an emperor live so far from Rome? From the historical records, the archaeologists knew that until the end of the 3rd century, Rome was the imperial capital, and that the empire was then split into 4 more easily governable regions, with Sirmium proclaimed the capital in the east. And the team were curious to know more about the city's role in this period of great change. In 2018, a new discovery downriver promised to shed more light.
Glatz is just one of the research areas here in Sirmium, defining whether Sirmium was such an important city as it looks like for the Roman Empire.
During excavations of the Roman villa at Glac, an exciting find emerged.
In 2018, when we found one coin, it turned out that this coin was made by Maximianus, and we suppose that Maximianus built the palace.
Maximian was the first emperor to rule Rome's eastern province. The team's findings suggest grand building projects in keeping with Sirmium's new status. And yet, the city's strategic position left it vulnerable. Even with its new structure, Rome was proving unable to secure its frontiers, as Sirmium would discover.
We can see destruction everywhere. The floors and roofs collapse. We have found numerous evidence of broken goods, broken statues, broken architecture that collapsed due to the fire.
The historical sources tell us that a group of Eastern warriors, known as the Huns, made incursions into the Balkans as early as 408, and that in 441 there was another attack led by a ferocious tyrant, Attila the Hun.
The Roman historical sources picture him and the Huns as some kind of monsters. The way that Roman writers describe their hair and their stature is like they were some kind of monsters. The Romans were really scared.
Could the terrifying Huns be behind the devastation of the city?
Based on the finds of burials in the Roman imperial palace in Sirmium, we can say that in the 5th century, this area of the imperial palace looks abandoned.
The timing of the destruction seemed to coincide with Attila's attack on the Eastern Roman Empire. But what became of Sirmium?
The population who continued to live in there lived in the rubble and inside the collapsed walls. I'm personally fascinated with the fact that they used collapsed walls to lean their houses, their humble houses made of wood and raw hide, which they used for the roofs of their tents. Completely new outlook of the city, which is not the city anymore.
Reduced to a shanty town and leaving a gaping hole on Rome's eastern frontier. Sirmium's devastation was an eerie foreshadowing of the fate of the empire itself.
Sirmium shared the future of the whole Roman Empire due to the fact that the western part of the Roman Empire collapsed a few decades after the Hunnic invasion.
The fall of Rome marked the end of the Western Roman Empire, but the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire continued to flourish. By the 6th century CE, it was at the height of its powers, stretching around the Mediterranean, from North Africa to modern-day Italy and Israel, where cities like Shivta in the Negev desert enjoyed wealth and prosperity thanks to the international trade in wine.
Grape seeds are the most abundant remains, telling us, together with the abundance of Gaza jars and wine presses, that wine production was the major occupation of the Shifta people in the Negev at the Byzantine time. We have lots of evidence, also external evidence, historical sources that tell us about the reputation of the wine across the Mediterranean sphere.
But it seems it was not to last. Archaeologists working in Shifta over a century ago made an extraordinary discovery.
Now we are entering on the main road that leads to the center of Shifta. And one important clue that we see in the main road that leads to the center of the village is the phenomena of the sealed houses, where you can see there is a complete house that was never excavated, and some dressed stones were used to close the entrance to the house.
What happened here? When did Shifta's people block up their houses? The team turned to the grape seeds for answers.
And the dates that we received, based on radiocarbon dating of seeds that we found on the surface, on the floor of the houses, all of them going to the mid-6th century and does not post-date the year of 550.
Armed with a date, the team looked more closely at the houses of this once magnificent Byzantine city.
We imagine that they meant to return. Because when you look at these houses and you see the size of the houses, the quality of the construction, the people here meant to stay here forever, but something went wrong.
The desertion is especially mysterious given Shivta bore all the signs of a city on the rise, with a growing Christian population.
And now when you're entering into the church, you can get the general impression of the size of the church, the quality of construction. This church was constructed at the mid of the 6th century, in the peak period of Shivta. Just a few years before the house were abandoned and sealed, renovation took place in this church. Another clue that all of the process of evacuation and abandonment, which led to the complete collapse of the Negev, was a rapid phenomena, probably within a few years.
Even without digging, the team have found valuable evidence of life here. Shivta's rubbish dumps contain precious fragments of textile that can be analysed in the lab.
They are just small pieces, but each one of them are made of a different fabrics. It could have been cotton, flax, wool, and from this particular piece of wool, we can also extract the DNA and identify the exact breed. And that tells us a whole set of new information regarding trade and movements of goods across the Middle East, down to the desert, coming from the north or from the south.
While Shivta's wine trade thrived, a lethal plague began to tear through the Byzantine Empire and beyond. Starting in 541, it killed as many as 50 million people, even afflicting the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, whose name it came to bear. Could the Justinianic plague help explain Shivta's fate?
We don't know what was the magnitude of the plague here in the Negev. We do see the process of barricading the houses and kind of leaving the different villages. So when we try to put a finger on when exactly it happened, we are around the mid of the 6th century. Some of them even focus within the decade of 541, 542. So it could have been that the evacuation took place because of the arrival of the plague. Exporting of goods could have led to the dispersion of the plague in the different harbors across the Mediterranean Sea.
While the team hunts for evidence, it looks like Shivta's trading networks could be a clue to the city's downfall.
Plague occurred in the other parts of the empire, and that affected the demand of export material from this part of the empire. Demands for goods that had been decreased dramatically and could explain the decline for the settlements.
Could the curse of a devastating pandemic have caused a drop in demand for wine, destroying the livelihoods of the people in Shivta and forcing them from their homes? Archaeologists continue to search for clues about the plague, but the Byzantine Empire would never recover its former glory. Meanwhile, an emerging Islamic civilization was closing in from the east. Coming up, a buried city in Spain.
There's a very strong chance that we have here the oldest mosque to be archaeologically identified in Europe.
How did Islamic invasion change life here? While in the east, the Byzantine Empire was gradually collapsing, in the west, a new power was on the rise. These were the Visigoths, Seizing the opportunity as Rome collapsed, they now occupied territory from southern France into Spain, where the jewel in the crown of its kingdom was the city of Recopolis. But mystery surrounds its fate. Unlike Paris and Toledo, cities built at the same time, Recopolis lies abandoned. Archaeologists have been excavating this lost city to find out why.
Contemporary historians say that the king, Leovigild, who united Spain and really put the Visigothic kingdom on a whole new footing in the 570s, built this as a royal city, Regia Civitas, and he named it for his son, Recored, Recopolis.
The Visigoths' buried capital has intrigued archaeologists since it was unearthed in the 19th century.
It gives us insight into the Visigothic monarchy, which was surely the most powerful and the most richly endowed of all the barbarian monarchies, the Roman Germanic kingdoms that sprang up in the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire.
Work here has revealed tantalizing clues about Recopolis's past glory.
The parts that have been excavated already include the palace with a very large open space. There are a series of luxury shops and 2 mansions, 1.5 of which has been excavated.
The team have only dug a fraction of the ruins, but Recopolis seems to have been vast.
In terms of circumference of the walls, Recopolis is bigger than contemporary Barcelona or Seville. Now, thanks to the ongoing archaeological projects that are afoot there, we are beginning to see the city as a whole.
Finds here hint at exceptional wealth.
We have also materials that came from many areas of the Mediterranean, north of Africa, Near East, the area of Constantinople. That doesn't mean that the people that live here receive products, luxury products, that is not usual in the Visigothic city.
But who were the Visigoths? What do the excavations tell us about their lives?
There's mansions, so we know that there were great aristocrats, and the Visigothic society was an extremely aristocrat-dominated society.
And richly literate, too.
The number of works written in Visigothic Spain in the 7th century is incredible. So it's a world in which literary production is going on at a high level, mostly religious in character, wonderful religious poetry. Also a world in which daily life had a lot of literacy in it.
But this thriving Christian culture was under threat. It was around this time that a new civilization was on the rise in the East.
Islam had gone from nothing in the Arabian Peninsula to conquering the 2 greatest world powers of the hemisphere, Persia and the Byzantine Empire of Constantinople. And so they reached the western end of the Roman Empire, which was North Africa. And they were on the straits looking across at Iberia.
The site of the clash with the invading forces remains a mystery. But a decisive battle occurred in 711, which saw the Visigoths roundly defeated.
Thereafter, we know that the Islamic forces moved north and across the peninsula, fighting a number of successful engagements.
Using geophysics to map what was beneath the ground, the archaeologists looked for links between the Umayyad invasion and the demise of this once great city. And they were taken aback by what they found.
We've had the extraordinary fortune of discovering something quite unexpected. a very large building, similar to that of Umayyad mosques. The orientation of this extraordinary building is towards Mecca, a mosque built after the Islamic conquest of Visigothic Spain. So there's a very strong chance that we have here the oldest mosque to be archaeologically identified in Europe.
If it is a mosque, it shows how the invaders started to make their mark. The city otherwise shows no signs of attack.
After the defeat in 711 of the Visigothic army by the Arabs and Berbers, 3 years later, we can consider that the former Hispania was not Hispania, but now Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus was an Islamic state.
Within a decade, the whole Visigoth kingdom had been conquered and most of the population Islamicized.
The Umayyad invasion changed Iberian history forever by taking this second largest landmass of any modern day country in Western Europe and taking it mostly out of Christendom. It transformed the path of Iberian civilization. It ended the Visigoths.
What the team can see is that people were still living in the city for some time after the Islamic conquest.
We know that it was abandoned by about 800. The stones were dismantled and carried a kilometer away to build a new fortified Islamic city, which is today Zorrito de los Canes.
The Arabic written sources say that Zorita was built with the stones of Recopolis. And this is a process very well known, not only in Recopolis, but in all the center of Spain, was the expression of a new society.
So what happened to life here?
The city dies or is replaced by a new city a kilometer and a half away. Its stones are removed to build a new city. Why was this site abandoned and the new site developed is an enigma. This is one of the questions for archaeology as we go forward. Why was this site abandoned and moved to another site?
The ruins at Recopolis bear testimony to a civilization that thrived with Rome's demise, but was cut down in its prime. But while the excavations reveal the sophistication of the Visigoths, so many questions remain, and the work continues to solve the mystery of why this once important and prosperous city was abandoned. Coming up, did the turbulence of post-Roman Britain see a warrior king swap his castle for a cave?
It's a period of immense risk to be a king.
It's an old cliche, but live by the sword, die by the sword.
Up until recently, these caves in Derbyshire were thought to be an 18th century folly. But now, a new theory has emerged that they in fact date to much earlier, to the 9th century, one of the most turbulent times in Britain's history, and that they were the refuge of the mysterious King Eardwulf, ruler of Northumbria, one of the many warring kingdoms of the time.
We know that he's got connections with the Pope and with the Emperor Charlemagne, and he seems to have been part of a political group in Britain that wanted to re-establish a connection with the new empire that Charlemagne is building on the continent.
While Eardwulf's fate is unclear, a powerful legend has grown up around him.
We know he's defeated, and he sort of disappears from the record, but there's a consensus that Eardwulf is the saint later known as Saint Hardolf. He seems to have lost his throne, but retired as a hermit here. Standing archaeology of this rock-cut building, it is not a natural cave in any way, shows some very early features. And we know they match the crypt at nearby Repton, which is only a couple of miles down the road. So we have features in there that seem very, very early, and we have historical evidence. So we know it's called Anchor Church from at least the 13th century. An anchorite is a hermit, so we know that at a very early date there is a hermit living here.
To piece together his story, we have to go back to Eardwulf's time as king at the Palace of Bamborough in Northumbria. Today, an impressive Norman castle stands on the site of a much earlier fortress.
Bamborough is a fascinating place. It's a little bit of a fairy tale castle. It's built on a rock outcrop. It's a fortress palace of the kings of Northumbria.
It was a time of conflict when soldiers were in charge.
We talk about it as a heroic age of these warrior kings, and they certainly were warriors. On the one hand, it's quite romantic, but on the other, it's a little bit mafia style. It's a protection racket. It's an old cliche, but live by the sword, die by the sword. When your power is based on violence, that's often how you will end up.
Did Eardwulf live and die by the sword, or end his days in peaceful retreat? What we know of his early life suggests a leader who turned the culture of conflict to his advantage.
Eardwulf is unusual in that in the 8th century we find a sort of breakdown of a royal dynasty, so we end up with competing dynasties vying for power. They're not there necessarily because of their bloodline, and Eardwulf seems to be very much one of these individuals. So he's risen to the throne based on, I would guess, personality and his association with other powerful individuals, which both makes him powerful and also vulnerable.
Threats to Eardwulf's power could have come from a variety of sources. The Kingdom of Mercia to the south, or rival factions in Northumbria.
Anglo-Saxon warfare, we can see it in the poetry. The reality is it's all on foot, it's quite brutal. The aristocracy are a fighting class. People are just going to give in, coming to an accommodation with them, becoming part of their kingdom, joining them.
Eardwulf would have had to have reached an agreement with the Mercians if he did end his days as a hermit. The cave in which he's meant to have lived was right in the heart of the original Mercian kingdom. At the time, Northumbria was still the dominant power.
King Eardwulf sort of fits within the central part of what we call sometimes the golden age of Northumbria, which is the time when monasteries such as Lindisfarne were producing extraordinary scholarship. We know that he takes power in 796. We have fairly decent records of that. We know he was deposed at least once, but we don't really know the circumstances in which he left power, or even exactly when. It could have been anything from about 808 AD to about 830 AD.
Excavations continue at Bamborough. Could the team unearth more clues as to how Eardwulf fell from power? He would not be the first ruler to die in his prime.
Only 30% of Anglo-Saxon kings during this period reached old age, and I think that alone shows the level of conflict, the risk of being deposed, not only by external forces who want your kingdom, by your neighbours, but even by your family. So it's a period of immense risk to be a king, and that's because everyone is vying for power.
No one knows how Eardwulf was deposed, but what we do know is that Northumbria went into decline while its neighbour thrived.
I think what you're seeing is the Mercian kings suddenly find themselves with bigger armies and more aggressive people who are there for plunder, for treasure, for land. So basically the torch passes between a rising kingdom that stopped expanding to a new kingdom that's still expanding.
If, as the legend goes, Eardwulf was given sanctuary in Mercia, what became of him? Could the ambitious king have calculated his best chance of survival lay not in combat, but as a religious hermit?
This man's a former king. This is quite a big place. It's got a chapel. It's got 3 quite large rooms. You can't just go and become a hermit. You have to be appointed as a hermit, effectively. So I think we can imagine him here, probably with disciples or even servants. So not a life of huge discomfort, but certainly not the life he was used to as a king.
Could a Northumbrian king have ended up buried and revered in the land of his enemies? And it's quite romantic. So I have a great deal of sympathy for those who put these blocks together and think they may have discovered some fascinating little corner of history that's been undiscovered. But I also think there's good reasons to be skeptical because there are real gaps and we can't make the connections solidly.
Perhaps the work at Bamborough will reveal more about the period of Eardwulf's rule and shed light on his fate. But whatever the truth of the king and the caves, the turbulence would only escalate. In the 9th century, life here changed dramatically. The Vikings had arrived.
The signs of conflict in this part of the country are all over the place. The great Viking heathen army that destroys the local monasteries, probably including this. Monasticism in this particular part of the country doesn't reappear until the 12th century. So with the great Viking raid, probably is an end to whatever was happening here. So conflict is really important to understand this site.
The centuries after the fall of Rome were once known as the Dark Ages. They saw civilizations rise and fall, cities wiped out by invasion, and plague ravaging through Europe and the Middle East. At the same time, there were periods when trade was booming, cultures were flourishing, and new world religions were emerging and spreading. But now, new forces were attempting to fill the gap left by Rome. A new curse was looming. Next time on Curse of the Ancients, the rise of the Christian warrior kings.
Of course, for the Saxons, this war meant the destruction of their culture.
This was not a typical Viking raid. The invasion was a punishment of the Christian king on pagans who lived here.
Was this the last stand for the pagans?
Up now, join an exploration through an iconic city that has both witnessed and made history in Treasures of Istanbul. Or over on SBS World Movies, Elizabeth Moss stars in the thrilling film Shirley.